we'll have a box at the table. We'll say goodbye before we leave. And also for the, oh my gosh, the form for the grant.
When you checked in, there was a sheet from the Alzheimer's Association that asked for today's date, your name, your address. If you can please fill that out and give it to one of us in the purple shirts or at the check-in table before you leave. It looks like this. It says Alzheimer's Association up at the top. We need this for grant money for the Alzheimer's Association. Very, very important. They are a volunteer-run organization and we rely on grants from the federal government. So please help us out by filling that out. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to consult everyone who has spoken because we saved the best for last. No pressure. So Dr. Anna Campbell-Sullivan is with the UT Medical School. She has her degrees from the University of Palo Alto, Stanford Consortium, did a fellowship at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, board-certified clinical neuropsychologist. She's an associate professor of neurology with the Glenn Biggs Institute for Alzheimer's and Neurodegenerative Disease, and with UT Health San Antonio. And that, of course, is a very condensed version of her bio. She is much more than that. But she's going to talk to us about challenging behaviors of trying for caregivers. So I will turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Campbell Sullivan. I know some of you. I don't know a lot of you. But thank you very much to the Alzheimer's Association and everyone for having me here today. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and that is challenging behaviors. And so this is a new talk for me. It's not a new topic, but we'll kind of go through it together. And I wanted to make this sort of a primer for everyone. So I'm not going to discuss all the challenging behaviors that exist in the world, but I'll touch on the ones that I see most frequently in clinic. So, how do I advance? Oh, okay. Stop.
There you go.
Stop clicking. There we go. So these are just some disclosures that I have. I do get some funding for some of our studies here at the Biggs Institute. And I have a little bit of an outline here. So the first part, we'll just go through an introduction, sort of a refresher on dementia. We'll sort of discuss some caregiver challenges. And then I really want to focus on current trends that we're seeing. So both here locally, but also nationally. So this is me. It might be time for a new photo. This is when I first joined the Biggs, or actually UT Health San Antonio in 2016. So I came down from Baltimore. I've been at Hopkins for a long time, but I'm a Texas girl. I thought it was time to come home. And I came on the promise of the Biggs Institute and was ecstatic when we were able to get Dr. Sudhashishadri to lead us. But since then, I have sort of started a lot of clinics. So some of those are our mind clinics, where it's a one-stop shop. You come and see a neuropsychologist and a neurologist in a single day. So we can expedite care. We can give you a preliminary diagnosis before you leave that day. And then with my colleague, Dr. Parker, we sort of founded and manage our FTD program, which is frontotemporal dementias. And so that's just to let you know that I see a lot of the most challenging neurodegenerative syndromes out there. So I work with some of our sickest patients and some of our most distressed caregivers. In the last couple of years, I've started to branch out a little bit more into research. And so I help lead some of our observational longitudinal studies. So I help co-lead our clinical core of our South Texas Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. And then I'm also the site PI for something called All-FTD. And so these are trials where patients and families enroll, and we just see them annually and kind of collect data. And we do that so scientists all across the world can gather that data and answer questions to hopefully find ways to make the disease more tolerable and eventually cure it. But this is something that's always been really near and dear to my heart, and especially those with younger onset or atypical dementias, or those who are dealing with really unusual or challenging behaviors. And I want to try and give those families answers. And it's important to me because once upon a time, I was one of those families. So let me introduce you to George Horton. So this is my dad, and he's a Texas boy through and throughout. He's born and raised in Houston, and a traditional guy, but also very sort of dynamic and very progressive. So I was an only child, and I was the apple of that man's eye. And he believed in me like nobody else. And I think I owe a lot of my success to him, because even when it was unwarranted, he supported me and was my biggest cheerleader. So I'm from a town of 3,000 people. Girls from my town don't study at Stanford. They don't go to Johns Hopkins. They stay home and they work. And so, and I did all of that because he believed in me first. But when I was in college, my dad had a pretty massive heart attack. And a lot of it was because he did not get regular medical care, because my family had their own small business. So we didn't have health insurance growing up. So about 2 months to the date, they finally get health insurance. My father was found face down in a parking lot in Houston doing the weekly shop for the house. And thank goodness he was in Houston, because they were able to take him to the hospital and save his life. And ultimately, he was diagnosed with cardiomyopathy. So he just had a big, floppy heart, which is actually pretty apropos for the level of love he had for all the women in his family. But he underwent surgery. They implanted the defibrillator so that if his heart stopped again, it would just shock him and he would get back to doing what he needed to do. And he did really well for a really long time. But when I was in graduate school, we started to notice some changes. And he never really made it quite back to baseline. So they sold the family business and he retired. And he moved to New Braunfels, to a little house where he could watch the deer, and he enjoyed it. And then we started to notice some of those more challenging behaviors. So there was a time where, so it's probably 10 years later, he's around age 60 at this point. I came home for Christmas and we're having a pretty big, pretty fancy family Christmas dinner. He had to wear a collared shirt and we all dressed up. And my mom's a really good cook and he's always been a fan of her cooking. But I noticed he started eating really quickly. And he finished within, I don't know, 7 minutes, whereas everyone else was just sort of, taking their time with the meal. And at the end of that 7 minutes, he picked up his plate and he started licking it clean. And I was aghast because I had my fiance there, I had his family there, and I was shocked. And I looked at my mom and she just went, I don't know. And this had been happening and we didn't know what it was. And he started to make comments that were like a little bit more offensive, definitely embarrassing. He was crossing the line with people. He would, he's always been one to be a little bit challenging, maybe a little bit provocative, but he's going too far and not recognizing it and not apologizing for his behavior. And then he started making some poor financial choices. And so taking out a second mortgage and not telling anyone. And so all of a sudden, there's no money, and it's really difficult to make ends meet. And then he started to get very rigid about his schedule and a little bit obsessive about things. So he wasn't calling me as much anymore, and he wasn't really talking, but I would hear him in the background, and he would be talking to my mom. He's like, tell her what Kelly did today. And he was talking about Kelly all the time, and I was like, who is Kelly? And it was Kelly Ripa. I don't know if you guys remember Kelly and Regis. It he was a big fan. He may have been her top fan. And he got very sort of obsessed about watching Kelly and Regis day in and day out. And as soon as she came on the screen, he would hoot and holler and clap and whistle, and it was it was the craziest thing you'd ever seen. And then he started some counting rituals, and a lot of sort of like what we would see in sort of really bad, like obsessive compulsive disorder. And so a lot of this was happening, and I was at the time in graduate school and learning about neurodegenerative diseases, but it wasn't really fitting any of the boxes that I had learned about. Like, this was a lot of behavioral stuff. His memory was fine, his memory was amazing. But the behavior had changed and the personality had changed. And so ultimately, he passed away. So it was only about 4 years where we had some of these changes. And he passed away at 64. So I had been at Hopkins a month, and I got a call that he had died unexpectedly in his sleep. And it was around that time that I was like, there have been a lot of changes. I think my dad had frontotemporal dementia, and we just didn't know what it was. And so now that's sort of why my crusade is here, and I always want to work with caregivers, because I want you guys to be able to put a name to the syndrome or the symptoms that you are seeing day in and day out. And so I want us to make sure that we're all on the same page. So when I talk about dementia, because this can be kind of confusing and hard to understand, all dementia means is that someone is having objective evidence of change in their cognition, right? So their memory is getting worse. And then we're seeing that play out in their day-to-day independence, their ability to function. Their memory is so bad, they forget to take their medication, and their blood pressure goes through the roof. Or their memory is so bad, they forget to pay the mortgage, and they get late fees. So we have to have these two things. We need the cognitive impairment, and we need the functional decline. That is all that we need for a diagnosis of dementia. But it gets a little bit trickier when we start talking about behavior. Because here, we're having evidence of behavioral change. So someone might get a little bit more disinhibited. They might become a little bit more apathetic. They're just not doing as much, which is a little bit more subtle. It's not as obvious as a very clear memory impairment. But we also want to see that it's starting to interfere with their daily life. So we might have someone who's so disinhibited that they might say the first thing that comes to their mind, regardless of who it is. So they might yell at their boss and get fired. Or they may make very offensive remarks at a dinner party and get disinvited from things. So a lot of these things happen, so it's the same, but just a little bit different. And when we talk about dementia and this sort of umbrella syndrome, there's different types of dementia. So Alzheimer's is a type of dementia. It's the one that we hear about most often because it's the one that's most prominent. Vascular dementia is a type of dementia. And then we start to get on the other side of that umbrella where we have Lewy body dementia or frontotemporal dementias. And we may not hear about these as much because they're a little bit more rare. They can come on younger, but oftentimes they have more behavioral issues. And then the rarest of the rare are those patients who have ALS, so Lou Gehrig's disease, with a frontotemporal dementia. So we essentially have two diseases in one person. And that's only affecting about 5 to 20% of those with FTD. So very rare diseases, but very challenging, right? And very difficult for caregivers to manage. So, and the reason that is because when we look at the brain and we see the areas where the brain is starting to shrink, in the FTD world, we're seeing most of the bad pathology build up in the front part of the brain, the frontal and temporal lobes. So if we think of our brain like a business, our frontal lobes are going to be our CEO. That's the part of the area responsible for multitasking, judgment, prioritizing things, inhibiting things, so not saying the first thing that comes to your mind. And so when you have changes in the frontal lobes, this is where you're going to have more behavioral issues. Now, Alzheimer's disease traditionally affects more posterior parts of the brain. So it's affecting the memory centers. Sometimes it's affecting the language centers, or our areas responsible for interpreting how we see the world. But it's not uncommon to have Alzheimer's patients who also have behavioral changes, right? It just depends where in the brain we're having that bad pathology build up. And it gets pretty complex, right? So these are sort of the now accepted different FTD clinical syndromes. And it's just a very messy slide, and it's really here just to show you how difficult it can be to tease these apart from one another. Because we have patients with Parkinson's-like disease and behavioral changes, or Huntington's disease, or we have patients who have prominent psychosis, and it's due to FTD, or changes in the brain. And then we have those who have Alzheimer's disease, but also frontal changes in the brain. So it's very complex. And it makes it harder because it doesn't happen overnight. We didn't wake up one morning and all of a sudden my dad was a completely changed person. This happened over years. And I heard someone earlier talk about how the disease had been building up in the brain probably decades before we saw symptoms. And that's exactly right. You have these bad proteins that are building up years and years before we ever see symptoms. And that can be scary for a lot of family members, but it's also an opportunity. That means our scientists have a long time. If we can identify it early enough, and we can come up with a molecule or something to help slow the progression, we have a long window to try and intervene and to stop these symptoms from progressing, stop these areas of the brain from sort of shrinking and dying. So I typically see patients who are in that mild cognitive impairment range, and those who are sort of have crossed over into the dementia range. Sometimes I see people in the moderate stages that are a little bit more advanced, but our goal is always to get people in early in the disease process, because that's when we have the most things available to us, and that's when we want to really make sure that our caregivers understand what they're dealing with and we can support them throughout the course of the disease. But it's really tricky. It's really subtle. So when we're looking at things like mild behavior impairment, we're looking at someone who's might have a little bit of loss of empathy, might be a little bit more disinhibited. So that usually manifests as someone who, they've kind of lost their filter. They're more focused on themselves, which can just happen in normal aging, right? So it's really hard to tease apart what are the effects of normal aging and what is the earliest indication of a neurodegenerative disease. The same thing with mild cognitive impairment. We know our brain changes as we age, just like our skin changes, just like our hair changes. I forget things that happened yesterday. I have trouble coming up with the right word. Is that part of normal aging, or is that the earliest sign I might have Alzheimer's disease? It's really tricky. And so that's why we definitely recommend people coming in and getting a workup. So I'm going to talk about some of the caregiver challenges that we all face. But before we do that, I want to sort of go through who are caregivers? Because I think it's important to sort of recognize some of these things. And I took all of this from the Alzheimer's Association website, which is amazing if you haven't looked at it before. But who are our caregivers? Well, about 2/3 of them are women. It's wives, it's mothers sometimes, it's daughters, sisters, aunts. It's affecting all races and ethnicities. A lot of times we live with our loved one who has dementia. A lot of times we're caring for our parents at the same time as we're caring for children. We call it the sandwich caregiver. A lot of our caregivers are making $50,000 or less. There's not a lot of extra money, and dementia is a very expensive disease. Our caregivers may not have a college degree, or about 40% of them have a college degree. 30% are over 65, 23% are under between 18 and 49. But I think the biggest thing I want to highlight, 83% of our caregivers are unpaid, right? So we have individuals who are not trained to do this, and are not being paid to do this, but we do this because we love our loved ones. And so the typical caregiving task, you guys are all familiar with this, we're helping managing activities of daily living. So we're cooking, we're driving, we're managing medications, we're managing healthcare, coordinating visits, getting to visits, following up on refills. We're assisting sometimes with bathing, dressing, shaving, brushing teeth, deciding when we want to have that battle, deciding when we want to maybe push it off to the next day. Providing daily supervision, coordinating support services. So if they're going to a day program, if we have an in-home caregiver. We're managing, coordinating the treatment team. We're also communicating with family, which can sometimes be a challenge. We're helping with decision making. For some families, we're learning new assistive equipment. So depending on what problems we're having with motor or abilities, we might have to do something simple like put in a shower chair or some rails, or we might have to deal with something called a Hoyer lift. We might have to get special spoons to help facilitate eating independently. And all the while, we're doing this while we're providing emotional support and comfort to our loved ones. This is a long list. Not surprisingly, it takes a toll. So when compared to other caregivers managing care for those with dementia have greater financial burden, have more significant emotional distress and more physical complaints. So it's hitting our wallet, it's hitting our mood, and it's hitting our physical abilities. So about 60% of caregivers report emotional stress, and almost 40% are emotional and physical stress. Dementia caregivers have greater levels of anxiety and depression. If we look at Texas, 60% of our Texan dementia caregivers have at least one major health condition. So imagine trying to manage all of the things on that list before, while also dealing with your own heart failure, or your own diabetes, or your own, physical problems. 27% of our Texas caregivers report more depression. So it takes a toll. And we've known that for a while. We have a lot of research to show that caregiving is hard, and that changes and declines in function and cognition can place a heavy burden. But caregivers managing behavioral dementias, they must combat the typical activities related to dementia caregiving while simultaneously navigating prominent behavioral changes. I want you to sit back and imagine trying to give someone their morning medications when they are actively accusing you of trying to poison them. Or they are hiding their finances or hiding their money around the house because they think you are stealing everything from them. Or we have the patient who isn't really aware or have much insight into the disease severity and thinks he can just drive and will take the keys and go to the grocery store. So a lot of these can be very challenging for caregivers. And not surprisingly, our caregivers managing behavioral dementias have 3 times the level of stress when compared to other dementia caregivers. So I wanted to look at what I thought was the most challenging dementia syndrome, and that is those who are navigating ALS with FTD. So we know ALS can cause sort of muscle wasting, so there's a lot of assistive technology. And so they're having to sort of learn about all these different things to navigate the declines in mobility, declines in function, and we have a lot of behavioral changes. So they looked at 55 families. 18 of those families had someone with a diagnosis of ALS FTD, and 41% had ALS alone. ALS is a hard disease. But they divided the group into those with high and low caregiver distress, all right? And they found that the single most influential factor to predict high caregiver distress was the diagnosis of ALS FTD. Not terribly surprising, right? If you're dealing with more behavioral problems, you have more distress. But what was surprising is that there were some families caring for these most challenging syndromes who had low levels of caregiver burden. So these are our unicorns. These are the people we want to study. We want to see, what are you guys doing differently than the others? And what they found is that it's really all comes down to coping style, right? So there's different theories on coping styles, but this is the one that has gotten a lot of research or support in the research. And they found that your coping style is directly related to your stress levels. And they found that those who approached dementia and dementia care with a task-oriented coping style had lower levels of caregiver distress than any other group. But let's be very clear. We don't stay in our task-oriented coping style all the time, every single day. I think sometimes we also divert to being emotionally oriented. So we might rely on others for emotional support. We might use humor to sort of make light of a heavy situation. We might try and use positivity or turn to religion. And honestly, there's times where you might need to avoid things. Sometimes we just need to go home and stare at a wall. Or we need to go home and we need to watch Netflix and not think about everything for a bit of that time. But they did find that those who engage only in avoidance-oriented coping styles had the highest levels of depression and caregiver burden. So although it's totally natural and normal to dip into that space, if we stay there indefinitely, it can really negatively impact your own health and sort of the health of your loved one. So let's look for some caregiver trends for challenging behaviors. And so the strategies for caregivers, I like to think of this at 3 levels, right? So we have what's happening at the national level, what's happening in your local community, which I think we can see is a lot based on what's going on here today, and then what's happening in your individual household. So at the individual level, and the individual strategies for caregivers, I think there's an effort to be more task-oriented in how we're combating this. I really want to focus on education. And we found that education can be the most effective strategy for reducing anxiety for caregivers. Has that ever happened to you where you think something bad is going to happen, you actually look into it, and what you found is so much less bad than what you were imagining? It happens to me all the time. So really, for strategies for caregivers, I want you to learn about your dementia syndrome, and dementia care. Because as I think we talked about earlier, not all neurologists are created equal. Not all dementias are created equal. Some respond better to different approaches and tailored interventions. So learning about behavioral symptoms associated with your dementia. And then I'm a big fan of looking at all of our national websites and then attending conferences like this. So already you guys are being very task-oriented by coming to this conference today. So I think that bodes well. I'm a big fan of the Tifa Snow YouTube videos. Have you guys heard of those? Yeah, they're really, really good. And I rely on them, especially when we're dealing with things like psychosis or challenging behaviors or, even just difficulty with incontinence. And then there are specific behavioral interventions that have gained some traction in trying to address more challenging behaviors. So there's something called positive behavioral support, and there's something called tailored activity programs. And so even though you may not have access to someone who's trained in positive behavioral support, you can learn about it and you can adopt some of those strategies and bring it into your home. Because I often think caregiving is a little bit like a shotgun approach. We kind of try everything and we see what works. And if it does, great, we keep doing it. And if it doesn't, we toss it out the window and we try something else. So I want to think a little bit about what drives behavior, all right? So this is pretty common. You're going to see this in cognitive behavioral therapy. You're going to see this in psychology books, dating back decades. And what they propose is that our thoughts affect our feelings, which affect our behaviors, right? So usually there's a stimulus, right? If I'm talking to you and I see someone smile, I'm going to interpret that and I'm going to have a thought about it. So maybe I see a smile, I interpret that as, oh, they like the talk. And then that in turn is going to make me feel good. And so that might affect my behavior, which is, maybe I'll get this talk more. Conversely, if I see someone frowning, I might have the opposite reaction. They hate the talk, I'm never gonna do this again, right? That's a typical reaction, and that's sort of what drives behavior. But now we have to think about it in the context of a neurodegenerative syndrome, so a dementia, right? So now we have that environmental stimuli, but we have brain atrophy. We have areas of the brain that have shrunk, they're smaller, they're not operating like they used to. They have cognitive changes, so they may not be able to pay attention or understand what's happening. They have diminished social cognition, so they're not picking up on social cues or interpreting things as they once did, okay? So when we have this same instance, I see someone smile, but I have a vulnerable brain, a brain that has experienced some changes. Maybe I didn't pay attention to the whole part of the smile, and I just looked at, the last few seconds, and now I'm interpreting it as a grimace. And so maybe I respond more aggressively. I think that is what we need to, someone talked about earlier about how it's really difficult to understand what our loved ones are experiencing and how they're interpreting the world. And it oftentimes comes down to how well you know your person and being willing to sort of adapt and change as they change, as the disease progresses. So that's sort of what's driving the behavioral changes. But these are the types of behavioral issues that I hear about most often in clinic. And again, it's not exhaustive. There are others out there. I know someone was talking about aggression earlier and getting into seeing your neurologist and trying to get medication on board. I think that's a great option. But the one that I hear about a lot that doesn't get a lot of attention is something called anosognosia, right? It's a really long word. It's hard to say. All it means is a lack of insight. Oftentimes I hear families come in and they say he's in denial. He just doesn't accept that he has a dementia syndrome, or he doesn't accept that something's wrong. But it's a little bit different. When we see anosognosia, that lets us know that the part of the brain responsible for sort of appreciating the gravity of the situation, that part of the brain has taken a hit. So a patient's ability to recognize where they are today versus where they were 10 years ago, that ability is compromised. So it's not that they're in denial, it's just that they no longer really have the capacity to see all that has changed. Does that sort of make sense? So when we hear about challenging caregivers or challenging family members who are in denial, sometimes it's because they just really can't. The part of the brain responsible for that ability it's no longer operational. And on one hand, that can be a bit of a blessing, right? Our loved one, in their world, things are kind of hunky-dory. They're going along, everything is fine. They don't really see a problem. And that can be a blessing because they don't actually see it. But that can be harder for caregivers because you do. And you really have no one to share that with, unless you have other family that are there to support. So anosognosia is something that I'll talk about a little bit more in detail. The other one I hear a lot about is apathy. And that really boils down to just a lack of motivation. They're just kind of sitting there, things they used to enjoy, things they used to like doing, they're not doing anymore. They're a little bit more passive. These are the ones that are just kind of sitting there throughout the day, like a monologue. And then we have those who are the opposite, those who are disinhibited. These are the ones who are overly engaged with others. This really just means impulsive. These are hasty patients. These are ones that are going up to you and talking to strangers and doing all sorts of things that you don't necessarily want them to do. And then we have more compulsive behavior. So that ritualistic, that rigidness, we have to adhere to a schedule. So I'm going to go into these in a little bit more detail. So we'll sort of start with anosognosia, this lack of insight. And really, where I see it play out most often is refusing medical treatment. So it makes sense if you think about it. If they don't think there's a problem, then there's no need to treat it, right? So we have patients on the very extreme end. I have patients in ALS clinic who can no longer swallow because the ALS has affected the muscles in their throat and their tongue, and they can't swallow. So when they try, they choke, they aspirate. And it's very dangerous, and it's scary, and it's hard to watch. And so we have patients, when that happens, oftentimes they'll do something that's very invasive, but they put in a PEG tube, a feeding tube. We can kind of bypass this area, but still get nutrients to the patient. And so I can have someone who's coming in and they are aspirating every single meal. But they don't want a PEG tube, not because, they've never wanted a PEG tube, simply because they don't really see the need for a PEG tube. They're like, yeah, I might cough a little bit, it's fine. Oftentimes they'll say, I don't have ALS. And then you say, well, what's causing all of these symptoms that you're having? And they kind of dismiss the question. So that's at the very extreme end of it. But refusing medical treatment can be very difficult for caregivers to navigate. Because how do you know that whether this is sort of evidence of the disease process, evidence of a dementia syndrome, or this is sort of like their long-held truths? And that's when I start thinking about, okay, what were they like before we had the disease? 10 years ago, would they have refused a PEG tube? If so, let's proceed. If not, let's talk about and see if we need to intervene. These are our patients that ignore medical advice. So even though they may not be able to handle all the bells and whistles in the car, they still think they can drive. Even if they are dinging up the sides of the car, or getting into wrecks, or getting lost every time they go out, they don't really see a problem with that, it's fine. And so they will continue to drive. And that's another one that is very challenging, because again, they don't see the problem. Like my dad, patients who are making poor financial decisions really without talking to anyone. And it's challenging, I think, especially in Texas or sort of in the South. You have someone who's always been very competent, very capable, has made very sound decisions all the way up until now. Like, when do you intervene? It can be very difficult to figure out where you do say something. And so that's where I really want to emphasize the way to address a lot of this is to focus on the strength of the relationship. And so I will have patients and loved one or caregivers in there with me, and I'll say, yeah, testing doesn't look good. We think you have Alzheimer's disease. We don't think you're safe to drive anymore. And they'll say, no, I can drive. and then we'll get a driving evaluation. We'll say, oh, look, you failed the driving evaluation. We don't think it's safe for you to drive. And they're like, I feel like I can still do it. And so that's when I say to the patient, like, who is this person next to you? It's a wife, daughter, sister, whoever. Do you love this person? So yes, of course. Do you trust this person? Hopefully they say yes. Do you think this person has your best needs at heart? And hopefully again, they say yes. And so you can draw on that relationship and say, if all those things are true, then I need you to trust your caregiver. And so if she says it's not okay for you to drive, it's not okay for you to drive. The last thing any of us wants to do is to take away something from our patients with dementia, right? Our goal is to keep them as independent as possible for as long as possible. We get no joy in telling people that they can't drive anymore. It is not a fun conversation to have. But I use the metric of safety as sort of my guiding light. So when safety becomes compromised, when they're making bad choices, not as affecting the safety of your financial future, that is when I want to challenge you and encourage you to intervene. Don't wait until it's too late. Try and intervene now. Try not to wait until there's a silver alert on the highway. We want to intervene now. And then we also need to learn to anticipate the rejection. Because just because we have the conversation once and they get the buy-in once, doesn't mean they're always going to remember it the next day. So you might have to repeat it a few times. And so just learning to anticipate when you're gonna have this battle and how you can sort of circumvent it and get around it. But this is one that I think is really difficult and difficult to know when to intervene, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of guidance. The next one is apathy, so that lack of motivation. And again, on the extreme end, we can see patients who just, they aren't responding. You'll call their name and they won't respond to you at all. They'll start to withdraw from others. They just become maybe very focused on their phone, very focused on rummaging through papers, or just watching television. I see that most often. And so the best intervention for that is prompting and encouraging as much as you can. And we also have to pick our battles, right? So sometimes we have to recognize the limitations and just the sheer facts of the disease process. There's no amount of prompting or encouraging that's going to get them to enjoy bathing, but we know it needs to happen. Maybe it doesn't happen every day. Maybe it just happens once a week, but I'm fine with that. So we have to sort of pick our battles and recognize where we can make gains and where we cannot. I also think it's really helpful to be very concrete with our plans and our tasks. I need you to do X. Please do Y. We want to simplify communication because sometimes when we have apathy, we have really slow processing. Think about all the brain power it takes to listen to a talk like this, to process what I'm saying, to sort of store it and to formulate responses. That's a lot of brain power, and it can slow down for our patients. So simplifying communication and being concrete can really help with some of this apathy. And then you also wanted to make direct eye contact. Like, I'm looking at you, I'm telling you, go brush your teeth. Things like that, and that can usually help get them off the couch and start to engage in the behavior that you need. But it's not easy, and no one likes to police behavior during their day-to-day. So if we skip teeth brushing for one day, I think we all understand. The next behavior is disinhibition, or sort of impulsivity. And so here I see it a lot, usually in spending money. We see it swearing at family members or strangers. So these are the patients, you take them out to the grocery store or to the doctor's office, and all of a sudden they might start yelling at someone or shouting profanities. I see a lot of shoplifting. For whatever reason, patients can get really attracted to shiny objects, and they just want to take them home. There's no ill intent. It's not malicious. They're not trying to sort of break the law. They see it, they like it, they want it, they grab it. There's also grabbing at strangers. This is where we get into a lot of trouble too. So if you have someone who's going to the grocery store and they see a super cute little kid, you're gonna run over there and try and grab it, try and hug it. Or if you see a young, attractive woman or a man, might run over and all of a sudden become overly familiar and start touching them. And that can be really difficult to manage and navigate. So a lot of times the intervention is sort of limiting access to some of these more difficult to address stimuli. So, we may only go shopping at a certain time. We may limit funds if we're sort of spending excessively. We also want to recognize a lot of this is part of the disease process. We can maybe improve the stimuli or reduce access to the stimuli, but sometimes we just have to recognize this is what it is. In those cases, I will have families who will make cards and they will give them to people. Oh, for some reason the same interventions are listed here. I'm sorry about that. But they'll make cards and sort of explain the situation. My loved one has X and doesn't recognize that he cannot touch you, or it might be overly familiar. Whatever it is, we can pass out cards as we go along. And then finally we have the repetitive behaviors. So this I see a lot in counting rituals, cleaning rituals, overeating, eating past the point of satiety, eating to the point where sometimes we have to put a lock on the refrigerator, or we have to hide certain types of food in the home. And so again, placing time limits on some of these rituals. So if someone's cleaning compulsively or praying compulsively, it's not bad, right? It's kind of good. We like our home to be clean. We want someone, if they have strong faith, we want to maintain that, their faith in God. But we might need to limit it from 4 hours a day to 45 minutes. And so we do that by adding other things into the schedule and creating sort of a more standardized schedule from day to day. We can redirect for other activities. So if we know that someone is in a cleaning ritual, we'll try and distract and do something else that they might find fun. And then identify self-soothing activities that are sort of tailored to the individual. And so sometimes we engage in these ritualistic behaviors because we're anxious or we're nervous, and we can't necessarily communicate that. And so finding things that are self-soothing. So sometimes a bath can be good, or just getting in a shower can be good. We do have some patients who shower compulsively, and in that regard, heavy blankets, like weighted blankets, can be good. Going swimming can be good. It really has to be tailored to their likes and their needs. And again, this is when the shotgun approach comes in handy, because we're just going to try all the things and we're going to see what helps. And that's when we go back to the education. And that's when we go back to the Teach Us Know videos, because I think that is really important. We talked a little bit about the positive behavioral support programs. And so really what that means is we identify a target behavior. So maybe it's overeating. And then we try to identify what's the possible motivation. So if they're overeating, well, eating can be rewarding, it can be stimulating, it can be soothing. What do we think is causing it? And then we want to try and intervene. So, what's the goal of our intervention? Well, we want to stop the overeating. But we also want to do so in a way that preserves or perhaps even improves our relationship with our loved one. And so we have very specific interventions. So like gum chewing, creating a schedule, it really sort of depends. But if you follow these steps, you can try some of these interventions to see if they help reduce those more challenging behaviors. The tailored activity programs, this typically involves working with an occupational therapist, but not always. Doesn't need an occupational therapist. So you identify specific activities that are tailored to the individual. So previously we were looking for things that were self-soothing. Now we're looking for things that are going to be engaging and interesting. So I've had some patients come in. One was a former secretary, and they found that she really liked filing. So instead of rummaging through the house and like tearing everything apart looking for one thing, they would give her sort of a task, and they would give her some file folders, and like they had an old drawer that she would pull out, and they would just look at A and B, C, and let her file to her heart's content. It doesn't matter if she files correctly. We just want her engaged in activities so that she wasn't tearing the house apart, all right? I had another patient who was a former accountant, and he was getting into a lot of trouble. He was stealing a lot, and then would take things and put them in different parts of the house and lose them, and then accuse everyone of stealing from him. And so he was an accountant. He liked numbers. They gave him some budgeting sheets, and so they saw if he was getting agitated or he was trying to like take things around the house or he was getting worked up. Oh, let's bring up the budgeting sheets. Can you please work on this for me? It would be really helpful, thank you. And it helped sort of redirect some of that behavior. And he enjoyed it. Sort of by the end of the task, when he was finished, he was in a much better place. So these are different activities, but they're tailored to the person. So if you know your person, try some things out, see what works, get creative. Now at the community level, we have a lot of things, and I only listed a few of them, and now that I've been next door, I realize there are so many that I left off the list. So hopefully, it sounds like you guys all got to walk around and see what's available. But what I'm most familiar with is the Biggs Institute, right? That's where I am, where we have social workers and case managers and counselors. We have something called Care Ecosystem, and that's for our patients who are dealing with just the most challenging behavioral dementias. There's the Caring for the Caregiver program. I know we have things like the Memory Cafe and skills trainings. The Alzheimer's Association, of course, which is amazing, has our San Antonio and South Texas group. They have their support groups. I know someone earlier mentioned sort of the benefits of a support group, and I'll say the research has shown that participating in a support group is the most effective in improving your quality of life as a caregiver. But that being said, I want you to try out all the support groups. Don't go to one and say, I hated it, and never go back. Try others. If you didn't like it, there's some caregiver in that group that wasn't a good fit for you, try another one. Go around until you find your people. But once you find your people, I want you to engage with them because it can be really helpful. Other caregivers have insights into the disease process that is not captured in the research. It's not captured in the clinic. So they're a valuable resource for you. And there's a lot of groups online, both nationally and internationally. And then also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Association for FTD, so we have a local San Antonio group. So if you have someone with a lot of behavioral symptoms, like what we're talking about, you can join that group. You don't have to have a confirmed FTD diagnosis. We're really dealing with symptoms here. So if your loved one has a lot of behavioral symptoms, go to this group. They can help. And then at the national strategies for caregivers, I'm not sure if you guys heard of the new guide model. This is a new program that's being launched by Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, so CMS. It's called Guiding an Improved Dementia Experience. And so what it is, what they're offering is a comprehensive dementia care, coordination, and management. Part of that, they're also going to have caregiver education and support, and most importantly, they're going to have respite services. So Dr. Shashadri and Dr. Patel are launching a guide program here in San Antonio. I think it's one of the very few in Texas, maybe the only. There's also national level, the Alzheimer's Association. That 24/7 call line is a gold mine. If you are at your wit's end, call them. Same with the AFTD 24/7 helpline. Call them. And if one doesn't answer, call the other one. So I really think nationally they're starting to recognize the importance of caregiving. And so I think these numbers are helpful, but also nationally go onto the websites and look for the tailored support groups. You can meet with other caregivers in California, in Oregon, in New York, in Kansas. They're all over. And so what we have locally is not meeting your needs. Take it to the next level. And so I'm going to leave you guys with some photos of my dad. And so that's him on the left holding me, my first pair of jeans. And then that's him in the middle laughing in the middle of my wedding reception. We had a very funny priest. And then the last one is him holding his eldest granddaughter. So thank you guys very much for giving me your attention.
You have a little bit of extra time.
Yeah, I wanted to build in some time for questions, so I assume there'll be
some Q&A, some questions,
and no silly questions for me, so. So I am at the Biggs Institute, and so if you call, I do know it's challenging to get in to see us. I know this, and we are working on it. I have transitioned a lot into doing more research, and so we are always taking research candidates. But right now, I think the best way to get in contact is to try and call the Biggs Institute and schedule an appointment. And it can be either with one of our neurologists, or it can be in one of our mind clinics, which is sort of a neuropsychology. Often we do request records, so We want to see what workup has been done previously, and we want to help get that information to guide you into the correct clinic, because we have about 22 different clinics. So.
So my mom recently got diagnosed in May, and one of the things that I'm struggling with is she does have some impulsivity, but she also puts herself down a lot. She did that while I was growing up too. She never felt she was pretty enough, smart enough. She comes from poverty, and so I can see where that comes from. Do you have any suggestions on what I can do to help with that self-esteem?
So, on one hand, that's a learned behavior, right? And she's been doing this a long time. It can be unlearned, it takes time. And so if we see her engaging in that, one thing we can do is redirect, go to something else. If you want to try and address it in the moment, and say, usually when that comes up, I say, would you tell me that? And then if she says no, I say, okay, then don't tell you that. Or I'll say something flippant like, don't talk about my mama like that. And that usually gives like a little levity to the situation. They can kind of laugh and sort of redirect into something else. But yeah, that's a really good question.
Dr. Sullivan, is there a particular book that you recommend on the TV? I know you mentioned the Tico Snow videos, and I've got the 24-hour caregiver book, but I was looking for something in particular on FTV.
I haven't seen anything recently that I love, but it's something I need to sort of revisit because it's been a few years since I've looked at those books. So let me, I know you, right? So let me do some research and get back to you on that.
And another one over here. That's okay, I'm gonna get my steps into it.
Hi, sorry. My name is Javiera, and my sister is very young. She's like 52, and she has, I've been kind of shut out of the caregiver. That's a whole other story. But when I do try to go places with her, she's the impulsivity, the saying, things that are off-putting to other people. And it's, and she has a daughter who's 16, and who tells me this is like a nightmare I can't wake up from. What can I and her daughter, some tips on that, like going out, she's like on this like obsessive walking thing, even though it's 100 degrees.
Yeah,
But like, you can't, it's hard to go walking because when someone's older, people are more empathetic. But when they're very young, people are like, why are you talking to me that way? Like it's a very different reaction in society with her behaviors, just tips.
Absolutely. Yeah. So a few things. The compulsive walking, I see that a lot actually. And when it does get really hot out, we do recommend walking indoors. Oftentimes we can just pace, like we'll go on a week, we'll go to a mall, something. And so, yeah, and it's challenging, right? Because then you're sort of opening up. And so some families I know will do real early in the morning, kind of before anything opens, to kind of burn off some of that excess energy without sort of increasing the likelihood of saying something offensive. I do have family members who carry cards with them. If it's especially egregious, they'll hand out the card, say, I apologize, whatever it is. And you can have different phrases on there. I've seen people do it a lot of different ways. And then sometimes we just have to recognize this is where we are in the disease process. This is what she's going to be doing now. And it might change, it might lessen, but it may not. And so we kind of need to buckle up and figure out what we're going to do. And try strategies that work for her. As far as the 16-year-old goes, there are online support groups for kiddos who are living with a parent who has a dementia syndrome. So I'd encourage you to go to the AMTD website. There's a local group in town, Wonders and Worries, I believe, and they offer individual support for kiddos whose parents have sort of a fatal disease, and they do consider dementia to fall into that category. And so we've had a few families send their kids through that program. You know, when it comes to FTD, not a lot of providers know about it. So, you know, and that is the same with, you know, the care, or the counselors for the kiddos, is you might have to educate them on the disease. And that just kind of comes with the territory, so it's really challenging. Yeah, but I'm glad you're there with her, I'm glad she's not alone. So keep doing what you're doing. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Hi, I just had a quick question. I mean, you talked about how hard it is to get an appointment. You know, my dad was diagnosed in May, but it's not till February. You know, I feel like time is of the essence with dementia. So when do I try to go somewhere else, or?
No, I think we have, Dr. Shoshani will get your information.
Give us your information.
But we do have waiting lists. We do have people cancel. We do get in touch with them, and we will try everything. But I'll let you talk.
I tell you, please give us, and anybody else, if you feel we are doing our best to, with the information that we have as a referral from the doctor, try and triage, sort of say who are the people who need to get in next week when there's a cancellation. Thanks to the legislature and the philanthropy of many of you, we have a 5-story building coming up where there'll be 75 exam rooms, and we're looking to hire more physicians. We have one physician who's now starting up at the Robert B. Green and one in the Hill Country. So I know it's not acceptable. We're doing the best we can. We don't also want to not spend time with people who are already with us. The guide program, for instance, we are not the only one, even in San Antonio, there are others. We are hoping that that can extend our ability to reach people even at their homes, even if they're not able to bring them into a clinic. With these challenging behaviors, it's a big issue coming into clinics. For somebody who asked for a book, we do, our counselor has some books, and there's one called Loving in Dementia, another called The Dance, that are sort of frontotemporal dementia focused. And if you find things that are very helpful to you, let us know. In this new building, the second floor is all for the community. So we have a music room, a library, a spiritual space, art therapy room, and you can tell us what are the best things for it. You know, we have had a San Antonio author share a book, which is a children's book about a buzzard that has dementia. So if you find something that's nice, email us and we will get copies of that. And I've had others who have written books about their own loved ones, their experience with their loved one. We keep copies of that. Anything like Dr. Sullivan, you can see, there's nothing as helpful as the experience of somebody who is lived it.
Doctor, what's a phone number and the email?
Yes, if you go to the Biggs Institute, that gives for the clinic, and if you put my last name and put uthska.edu, it'll come to me, and I'll direct it to the right place.
Thank you. And this is Dr. Subha Seshadri. She's the founding director of the Biggs Institute. That's okay.
Dr. Sullivan, I have a question. So my mom's initial neurologist, when she was diagnosed back in December, which at that time her neurologist said that she had major memory loss, most likely Alzheimer's. But Arisa stayed at the hospital a week and a half ago when the neurologist saw her there. Because of the symptoms that she was presenting with, one being with a stiff hemorrhage in the arm, which that just came out of nowhere. She stated that she was showing Parkinsonian type symptoms. So basically she thought it was Lewy body, which was just absolutely terrifying. And so she's now in a skilled nursing rehab for the next 3 weeks. She just, on Monday, she'll complete week 1. And we're trying to get her to see her regular neurologist because now we're just kind of confused. Is it Alzheimer's? Is it Lewy body? And are there resources specific to Lewy body, either at the UT Health or where do we find information on this specifically?
Yeah.
Lewy body.
So I will say, from start of onset of symptoms to diagnosis, for all dementias, it can take a few years. And you can start with one dementia syndrome and end up somewhere completely different by the end. And that's sort of, as symptoms arise, as maybe things become prominent, as we start to recognize things, it sort of changes. And so, it's not uncommon, right? I think working with or finding a neurologist who is a cognitive behavioral specialist can really help clarify that differential diagnosis. Unfortunately, there's no blood draw, there's no test we can do specifically to say it's Alzheimer's or not, but there are things called biomarkers, right? And so these are tests that we can do that help us identify what we think the underlying cause of the cognitive behavioral change is. So there's something, especially with some of our Parkinsonianisms, we can do things called a skin biopsy. And that can help us decide what we think it is and what we think it isn't. We can also do things that's a little bit more invasive, where we'll do a lumbar puncture and take some fluid from the CSF and send that off to see if we think there's amyloid. There's more advanced types of imaging, and the imaging can help show if we think there's amyloid in the brain. And doing all of these things plus sort of their exam can help us rule things in and rule things out. But there are other, Dr. Shishadri, what do you want to add?
I think was just answering the part of your question about can you come to the base on neurology? Yes. We are one of 20 centers in the country that is considered a dementia with Lewy body center of excellence, just as we are for frontotemporal dementia. Sometimes the same tests for Parkinson's, like what's called a DAT scan, can help. About 20 to 30% of people have both. So that's one of the things that makes it very confusing. Some of the treatments we do for Alzheimer's, fortunately, they don't harm anybody with dementia with Lewy bodies. Usually that does help the memory. But the treatments for their Parkinsonism can make the behaviors worse. And treatment for behaviors can make the Parkinsonism worse. So I just wanted to add to everything that Dr. Sullivan is saying. She's often the person who does a very detailed assessment, and along with the neurologists like Dr. Parker or Dr. Horn or Tanner or somebody who will make the diagnosis. I think the biggest issue is that we have many people who want to see us, so it takes a little longer. All right.
I think we're at time.
Great.
That's good.
Yeah.
Any closing remarks or just to say?
I just want to say thank you. This is the first time I really talked about my dad, so I appreciate you guys being very kind.
And without tears until now. I can't even think about my mom without crying. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank you, Dr. Sullivan. Thank you, Behaviors, or clinical social worker. That's huge for us as well. I'm going to put in a shameless plug for Aging Life Care Managers as well. I'm a past president of their board. I'm a current president of the certifying board, so aginglifecare.org. In the meantime, as you're trying to get into see folks across the country, there are care managers that can help plug you into different things, as well as, of course, the Alzheimer's Association. The Alzheimer's Association has a wealth of knowledge, and so we're so lucky to have the Biggs Institute here. I don't know that you guys know how, I mean, this is huge. It is huge that we have this center of excellence here. But they do sometimes have a waiting list. And so, the Alzheimer's Association, the aging life care managers have some other resources that can be a stopgap until they can get you in to the Biggs Institute. So I do want to say thank you all for attending. I want to thank certainly the Alzheimer's Association for all of their work. Yeah. I'm going to tell you two people that hate attention, so I'm going to point them out. Dianne, Teran, you're going to stand up. Yes. And the one who hates the most, she's grimacing already, Ginny Funk, back in the back. These are the folks that you'll talk to if you go into the Alzheimer's Association or make an appointment. They're a wealth of knowledge. They have no problem talking to you one-on-one. They just hate crowds. So, oh yeah, anyone on the committee still in the room? I know we acknowledged you guys in the morning. Definitely want to thank all of our sponsors. The food was fantastic. Chapters Living for breakfast. The Law Office of Carol Birch for lunch. There's still
12 boxes, and that's it.
Okay, the buzzard's got everything. I mean, people got everything but the 12 boxes. And so there are a few boxes left, and there's so much water. There's so much water. It's 407 degrees outside. I just checked from my watch. And so please take some water to stay hydrated. I definitely want to thank AARP and the Senior Planet for doing it online. So, and I think make sure you turn in your ARPA form, please. Budgeting, we can't pay for things like this without that funding, so please turn in your that ARPA form. Okay, and thank you, and we'll see you all in very soon.